You know, it occurs to us that we really haven't covered much in the way of PlayStation 2 shmups. I mean, so far we've only really jumped into 2, and even then the latest title we covered was over 9 years ago. Time to fix that because we have way more of them now, and to kick off Series 12, we're gonna home in on what could be the heaviest hitting of them all. Cave games were a staple of the Xbox 360's lineup, but many of the games that saw release there were preceded by games on the PlayStation 2. While Dodonpachi Daiojo also saw release on the Xbox 360, it was on the PlayStation 2 first. Same goes with the original Mushihime-sama, but one of the Xbox 360's more elusive shooters, Pink Sweets, would only see home release on the Xbox 360, while its port predecessor stayed exclusively on the PS2.
Ibara is a tate vertical shooting game developed by Cave and released to arcades in 2005. Cave would later handle a PlayStation 2 port of the game, which would be published to the system by Taito in 2006. As another rather infamous title from Shinobu Yagawa, the same programmer behind Rekka and Battle Garega, Ibara has yet to see another port, making the PlayStation 2 version fairly sought after. Let's take a closer look.
The first thing that players are going to notice about Ibara is how closely it plays to Battle Garega. Some aspects are a bit more subtle than others, but it's very clear that this is a Yagawa joint from the control to the weapons to the bombers and more. Though the ships available are far more limited, players still have some choice, which we'll look at shortly.
The controls here are basic. Players move their plane with the 8-way digital control via the D-pad. This can also be executed with the left analog stick. The player's movement isn't especially snappy here, which can be an issue unless the player knows exactly what's incoming and where their opposition will lie. This greatly factors into the game's challenge, as the slower movement is purely by design.
Players fire their weapons with the cross button, which does a fine enough job in taking out basic popcorn enemies. Like Battle Garega, players can upgrade their firepower, in this case through silver bullet icons. Smaller ones will build the player's level through multiple pickups, while large ones will boost the player's level with just one. A maximum level of 6 can be achieved with more small items required as the player's power increases. A special power-up granting full power can also be triggered through very specific conditions, but this can be very difficult to do, and it can also be done in more than one way.
A lot of enemies and shots will be whizzing around all over the screen, so players will sometimes need to lay down more robust fire with a bomber. Players can deploy a bomber using the circle button, but how the button is pressed will result in different outcomes. Ibara features two different bomber styles, a fast, high-damage bomber which is deployed simply by pressing the bomber button, and a strategic Hadouken shot that draws a bullet-canceling barrier behind it and creates a damaging field on impact with a larger target. The barrier it leaves behind will last for a decent amount of time before fading and allowing bullets to pass.
And there's more. Like Battle Garega, small and large bomb items exist, with 40 small bomb pickups required to stock one large bomber. The normal bombers can be launched regardless of how many small items the player has, but will change in strength or duration based on how many or how few the player has. A large bomb will result in the best bomber performance. However, the Hadouken always requires a full bomber. Both are very useful in areas with the most dense fire, and the Hadou in specific is fantastic versus bosses.
As players make their way through the game, a number of special weapons can be collected to boost the player's offensive power. Much like the option-style bits in Battle Corega, these special weapons are represented by options that will fly in formation with the player. Machine guns, 5-way shots, rockets, homing missiles, and more can be equipped to the left, right, and rear of the player's aircraft, making it a formidable force against the enemy opposition.
But it goes further. If players pick up a weapon different than the one in place from the direction in which it's mounted, it will be replaced. The 3 main zones around the player's aircraft span 120 degrees from the center of the plane's nose. Keeping this in mind should allow for a good amount of weapon strategy for loadout and scoring. Some special weapons are rarer than others too, with some appearing with variable frequency from playthrough to playthrough. This can definitely throw a wrench into any plans of formulating a strategy around these sometimes powerful specials.
While there is definitely far less choice when it comes to player aircraft in Ibara, there are actually some striking differences between the Player 1 and Player 2 ships. The game can be played in a single-player manner from either Port 1 or Port 2 on the PlayStation 2, allowing for either Bond or Dine to be selected as a result. In the case of Bond, his Red Negotiator has greater speed and slightly weaker fire, with a faster bomber attack akin to the Silver Sword in Battle Corega, though it only fires forward rather than the opposite direction of movement. Dine's Blue Negotiator has slower speed, more intense fire, and a more gradual bomblet-type bomber.
Each of these planes also has multiple fighter types available in the options menu, featuring alternate bomber types and fire. Fighter type A, B, C, and D can wildly change the tide of battle based on different playstyles. And of course, with a game as brutally difficult as Ibara, players will need all the help they can get, which actually brings us to a couple of strategies that we started employing when playing this game. One of the best defenses is to prevent bullets from even occurring. Fast aerial kills are helpful, but larger ground-based enemies can pose a problem. Point blanking or staying on top of a ground-based enemy while attacking can kind of confuse aimed turrets, allowing for a more manageable kill and a cleaner screen. Another neat defensive technique that admittedly isn't as reliable as we would have liked is the Aura Blast. Collecting a new weapon, a full bomber, or upgrading the player's weapon power will create a red aura around the player's aircraft, canceling bullets in its area of effect. It's very brief and its range is limited, but it's saved our bacon more than once.
Ibara plays over the course of 6 stages, but like Battle Corega, rank will constantly fluctuate based on what the player collects, whether bombs are used, and yes, whether the player dies. There's just an absurd amount of things to take into consideration for rank management, and an intimate knowledge of how it all works is crucial for player success. Pretty much typical Yagawa. It would take an entire episode just to describe and demonstrate, but thankfully guides exist online. The PS2 version also has much of the slowdown from the arcade version removed, making it a much more formidable game.
Enemies and other aspects of the game can also change based on many factors, meaning that any given playthrough can change drastically from attempt to attempt. With 8 primary and secondary difficulties and multiple modes, including one with a second loop, there are all sorts of options for most players of intermediate skill and up. Make no mistake about it, this is definitely not a friendly game for newcomers, doubly so if you don't especially like it when a game laughs at you every time you die. Given the removal of a lot of the slowdown in this version of the game, players can balance things out to more manageable levels by reducing the difficulty and slowing the bullets. And while this only makes things slightly less hard, it's better than being blindsided by bullets moving too fast to properly read.
There's also the PS2 exclusive Arrange mode, which remixes the core gameplay into an all-new single-player experience. At its core, the basic controls and rank effect are all more or less the same, but with a twist. Players collect weapons for use at any time, rather than having them replaced with new ones as they are picked up. Pressing the square button allows players to cycle through the weapons they've collected thus far, which can be better or worse depending on the situation. A number of formation options also exist, which can be cycled through with the triangle button.
The current rank is displayed along the top of the screen and, of course, mounts significantly, especially with high score items. Thankfully, bombers can be used to convert bullets to roses, which helps reduce the rank outside of, death. For our money, the search option makes for the most effective crowd control, especially when dealing with larger enemies. Unlike the arcade mode though, players cannot continue if they run out of lives, so getting extends through score can be critical. Point blanking ground enemies is also a very helpful strategy in this mode as well.
Many players have criticized Ibara's PS2 port in the past as having a few issues. The removal of critical slowdown is one thing, but it has been proven that high scores can still be achieved in this version, making it less of an issue. However, there is a touch of input lag present. We know that the bombers are delayed, but that's by design. However, the movement input itself has maybe a frame or 3 of delay, which can be felt even through the lagless OSSC on a 1 millisecond monitor. We have more issues too, though we'll address them later on.
But how fun is Ibara? Well, for those with the resolve to go up against the Yagawa brand of death to begin with, pretty fun. There's definitely enough depth here to keep most players engaged, so long as they know full well what they're getting into. Novice players and even some intermediates may still have a pretty hard go at it though. Ibara is a title that needs a lot of dedication, fine-tuning, strategy, and of course patience to get the most out of, regardless of the mode played. Thankfully, Ibara features a practice mode for players to get acquainted with the areas and bosses of stages 1 to 6. And selecting restart from any given stage in the main game will allow players to start from the beginning of the area with the same score and power-ups they had when they began. Those scores are not counted when this happens. Of course, extends are extremely helpful in this regard, and like many other of Cave's titles, there's a lot to unpack. Ibara has all kinds of scoring methods for players to take advantage of, which could probably fill an entire episode on its own. Bullet impacts, enemy destruction, collecting weapon and bomber items beyond maximum power in stock, duplicate special weapons, heck, even restarting the stage in a range will add more points to the counter. But for brevity, we're only going to feature on each mode's most effective mechanics. We know some of you don't exactly like it when we go on and on about the mathematics behind Cave's shooting, so here we go.
In Arcade, medaling is going to be the player's main source for pointage in a hurry. Starting at 100 points and growing with each subsequently collected medal to a maximum of 10,000 points, an extend is completely possible starting in Stage 2 on medaling alone. As each extend only requires 1 million points, 1 extra life per stage is a reasonable goal, given the amount of medals a player can theoretically collect. Roses spawned from bombers and Hado shots can also boost the player's score significantly when properly deployed, though this might lead to a tough boss encounter if the stock runs dry.
On the topic of medals, a number of places in Ibara can be bombed to reveal a hidden cache of them for players to collect. Especially in Stage 2, hovering over hidden medal spawn points can boost the medal value to 10,000 points with almost no effort at all. Of course, missing a medal will reset the value to 100 points, so revealing hidden medals should be done with caution. It's entirely too easy for a bunch of them to leave the screen, resulting in a broken medal chain. However, even if a swath of them leaves the screen, if the player can collect the last displayed medal remaining, the chain can be saved.
Arrange mode works primarily the same, but the rose bonuses take a much more central role in getting big scores to happen. When bombing, or when a bullet cancel occurs, the roses converted from bullets will be accompanied by a multiplier that is dependent on the rank at the time they appear. The higher the rank, the more this will be worth, up to a maximum value of 300 times. However, collecting these roses will subsequently reduce the rank sharply, which would then need to be boosted by high-value medals. This flux is a pretty engaging system, but requires a lot of discipline and skill to properly achieve.
Particularly in a range where players simply need to pick up any given weapon only once for continued use by selection, any additional weapons collected of a type already acquired will boost the player's score by 10,000 points each. This is also the value awarded in Arcade, but it's harder to consistently get this bonus. Of course, a range's extend score is 10 million points rather than only a mil, so this advantage is definitely a big help.
Ibara features a local leaderboard to maintain the player's score. This leaderboard can be saved to a memory card, 8 megabytes, for PlayStation 2 registered, to preserve the player's exploits. Of course, continuing on Arcade will wipe the player's score, and once again, restarting a stage will prevent a player's score from being ranked in, despite being maintained.
Oh, how we wish this port of Ibara was better. It's baffling to us that some Cave ports on PS2, in the form of Arika's Dodonpachi Daiojo and Espgaluda, are rather stunning, especially since they display inglorious extra scalable 240p when switched into Tate. Cave, on the other hand, decided to throw Mushihime-sama and Ibara through the ringer, adding an upscale and forced filtering into the mix that does more harm than good. They display exclusively in 480i, the bottom barrel worst resolution for today's displays.
What this ends up doing is making everything on screen blurry and choppy. Not so much the frame rate, of course, but the representation of the pixels that would otherwise have looked exquisite in 240p. The FrameMeister does this game no favors regardless of whether it's interfaced in YPB PR component or RGB SCART. Fine-tuning the OSSC was our best bet, and we know you've seen the picture shutter from time to time. Basically, if you're not playing on a CRT on its side with SCART or component inputs, Ibara is going to look like garbage. It took us 2 whole days of fiddling and tests to really nail down the best picture, and even then, we're not especially satisfied. But those are the limits we're working with. It is possible to run a hacked version force the 240p from a hard drive though, but as this is tantamount to piracy, it's by no means an official way to do so.
And that's a real shame because we absolutely love the overall design, from the negotiators to the Rose Sisters to the enemies and bosses. The kinds of design at play here is some of the best there is. And shoot, it wasn't even really recaptured in pink suites, though the color overall is much more vibrant than that of Ibara. The backgrounds here often leave a lot to be desired. The color scheme for each area is super muted, with a washed out, mostly gray motif that works well for purple bullets but not so much for the blue ones. This makes for a lot of deaths due to hard to see shots. Despite this though, the locales are still sufficiently diverse, making things easy enough to identify at a glance. The fact remains though, the slice to bits imagery is less than thrilling on today's displays.
Thankfully, Ibara makes up for its visual shortcomings with some incredible sound. Clear voices, a menacing announcer, and a super crisp Shinji Hosoi soundtrack highlight Ibara's overall presentation. There are some really great heavy metal style tracks here that add the right kind of tension to the action on screen, and the selections here are all winners. The arranged mode even has a completely new soundtrack with arguably better tracks, reminiscent of Hosoi's work in Under Defeat.
Of course, our one main complaint with the sound in general is the taunting laughter players will need to contend with upon death. It's just insanely irritating. We would venture to say that if Cave really needed that to be in there, especially in a game where players will die hundreds if not thousands of times, at least save it for game over. I mean, come on, it's a bit much.
Rounding out the presentation in Ibara are a number of wallpapers for playing the game in Yoko, left and right tate rotation, sound and sound balance options, and a full image gallery featuring full-color art of the Rose Sisters, the Negotiators, key art pieces, and a wide variety of concept and mechanical designs, all in a fittingly simple and mostly English menu. The story scenes and boss VO are all in Japanese though.
So in the end, how does Ibara on PlayStation 2 stack up? Let's take a look. Generally speaking, Ibara controls very well despite the playership being on the sluggish side.
A touch of input lag definitely exists though. It's ever so slight, but there.
Yagawa's sweet dreams are filled with the tears of frustrated players. That's just how Yagawa do. This game is hard as hell, but not quite Garega hard, and there are ways to mitigate the amount of death shot at the player through various tactics.
Of course, a lot of practice and dedication is going to be needed to plot it all out, especially with a lot of the slowdown removed on the PS2.
Between arcade and arrange, with the extra practice modes available to really get the feel for every stage and boss, there's a good length to Ibara in the quest to get that 1cc.
Its staying power will hinge entirely on whether the player has the resolve to keep going though.
Visually, the forced filtering and 480i resolution to Ibara make what should have been an exquisite looking game depressingly crap instead.
The best way to play Ibara might be a component or SCART equipped CRT on its side.
Shinji Hosoi's epic soundtracks are great in arcade, but even better in arrange.
The sound effects in VO are also generally great, save for the irritating laughter players have subjected to with each life lost.
It's very clear that there's a lot of Garega DNA in Ibara, but the addition of the Hado gun mechanics and multiple fighter types makes Ibara just a bit more flexible. And having all kinds of variables actually remix enemies and their placements on the fly is also pretty neat.
The arrange mode is also an excellent evolution to the formula, making the PS2 release of Ibara perhaps a touch more essential than other cave ports, visuals notwithstanding.
Ibara is currently the leader among all shooting games on PlayStation 2 when it comes to cost. It's not quite what we call extreme, but its very high typical price pushes boundaries we're not sure it could come back from.
As such, though it sports an excellent arrange mode and great practice features, its inherent issues and high cost make for a very iffy value for its price.
We know that the similarities to Battle Garega might scare newer players away from this title, but it was definitely a fun time while it lasted, especially when we finally settled on as good as a compromise as we could with regards to recording quality. Still, there are some pretty big issues with this release, confusing ones, frustrating ones, yet we still had a pretty good time, and we're getting better. We just wish it looked better is all. In the end, Ibara still manages a decent 4 out of 5. Ibara can be found pretty easily at auction for, admittedly, pretty outrageous prices. Holy moly, it's finally time to dive into Ginga Force in episode 282 of Bullet Heaven. We wanted to cover it years ago, but it kinda got away from us. We hope it was worth the wait.
Then it's on to our first seasonal special block. Indie Geddon kicks off with Xenodeath from Grybanzer Fox.